I picked up a hitchhiker, and I shouldn't have. The silent passenger. The road stretched endlessly before him, swallowed in darkness. Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his headlights carving a lonely path through the night. The gas station attendant had warned him. No one drives this road after midnight, but Daniel was in a hurry, chasing time, chasing something unseen. Then he saw him. A lone figure stood on the side of the highway, barely illuminated by the flickering glow of a dying streetlight. The hitchhiker wore a dark jacket, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. He didn't wave, didn't step forward, just stood there, as if he had been waiting. Daniel slowed down, hesitating. It was against his better judgment, but the isolation of the road gnawed at him. The thought of another presence, even a stranger's, was oddly comforting. He reached over and unlocked the door. Without a word, the hitchhiker slid into the passenger seat. The car filled with an eerie silence. The man's presence was heavy, suffocating. His face remained turned toward the windshield, features barely visible in the dim light. Daniel cleared his throat. "Where you headed?" No response. He tried again. Rough night. Still nothing. Daniel forced a chuckle, gripping the wheel. Not much of a talker, huh? The hitchhiker remained motionless, hands folded in his lap. The dim dashboard light flickered, making the shadows dance across his unmoving face. The silence stretched, thick and unnatural. Daniel's unease deepened. He kept glancing at the man from the corner of his eye, trying to find some detail, something that made sense. But the more he stared, the stranger it felt. The hitchhiker's breathing was absent. No rise and fall of the chest. No shifting in the seat. Just stillness. The road felt longer than it should. Hadn't he passed that same crooked road sign miles ago? A chill crept up Daniel's spine. He swallowed hard and flicked a glance at the rearview mirror, and froze. The passenger seat was empty. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. His breath came in short gasps. He twisted in his seat, eyes darting to the side. The seatbelt was still buckled. The door hadn't opened. And yet the hitchhiker was gone. The car swerved as panic seized him. He slammed on the brakes, tires screeching against the empty road. His breath was ragged, hands shaking as he scanned the darkness outside. Nothing. No movement. No sign that anyone had ever been there. Except for one thing. In the dim glow of the dashboard, he saw a single handprint on the fogged-up passenger window. Fresh, still dripping. His own breath caught in his throat. The silence of the road was deafening now, pressing in from all sides. And then, from the back seat, a whisper. "Keep driving." The blood-stained jacket. The highway stretched long and empty beneath the cold glow of the moon. Claire's hands gripped the steering wheel, her tired eyes flicking between the road and the fuel gauge, dangerously close to empty. The next gas station was still miles away. She exhaled, glancing at the clock, 12:43 a.m. She hated driving this late, but the sooner she got home, the better. Then she saw him, a lone figure standing at the edge of the road, illuminated by her high beams. His head was down, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. He wore a hooded jacket, the fabric torn and dirty, as if he had been walking for miles. Claire hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to keep driving. But the road was deserted, and the sight of him, shivering in the cold, gnawed at her conscience. She slowed down and rolled the window down slightly. "Need a ride?" The man lifted his head. His face was pale, eyes hollow and sunken. Without a word, he nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. "Where are you headed?" she asked, forcing a polite tone. "Gas station." His voice was flat, emotionless. Claire nodded and merged back onto the highway. The air in the car felt heavy, the silence stretching too long. She snuck a glance at him. His hood was still up, shadowing most of his face. That's when she noticed it. His jacket. The fabric was dark, almost black, but the sleeves, they looked wet. The dim light of the dashboard cast an eerie sheen over the damp material. And then her stomach twisted, the unmistakable color of deep red smeared across the fabric. Blood. Claire swallowed hard. "You okay?" she asked, her voice careful. The man turned his head slightly, his lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile. "It's not mine." Her pulse pounded in her ears. The air in the car suddenly felt suffocating. She forced a laugh, pretending she hadn't heard what she just heard. The gas station. Just a few more miles. She kept her eyes locked on the road, fingers tightening around the wheel. Every second stretched unbearably long. She could feel him watching her now, could feel his presence shifting, inching closer. Then headlights. The gas station flickered into view like salvation. Claire pulled in too fast, tires screeching as she slammed the brakes. Without looking at him, she unlocked the doors. "Here you go." The man didn't move right away. Then slowly, he unbuckled and stepped out, his damp, blood-stained jacket rustling as he moved. He turned to look at her one last time before shutting the door. Claire's hands trembled as she threw the car in reverse, peeling away as fast as she could. Her chest heaved, breath ragged, but she had made it. She was safe. Or so she thought. The TV screen in the gas station window caught her eye. The news played in eerie silence, the headline flashing across the bottom. "Breaking news, fugitive on the run, armed and dangerous." And then his face, staring back at her from the screen. Her blood ran cold. She snapped her head back toward the gas station lot. He was gone. Only the dark, empty road remained. And on the passenger seat, where he had sat just moments ago, a single item remained. His jacket, still wet, still dripping. "Would you like any tweaks or a continuation?" Nowhere to drop off. The highway stretched into endless darkness, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the desert night. James had been driving for hours, the rhythmic hum of his truck's engine the only sound keeping him company. His shift was nearly over, just a few more miles before he could pull into a rest stop and get some shut-eye. Then he saw her, a lone woman, standing by the roadside, illuminated by his high beams. Her long dress billowed slightly in the dry wind, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She looked lost, frightened. One bare foot was slightly lifted, as if she had been walking for miles. James slowed the truck to a stop, rolling down his window. "You all right, miss?" She hesitated, then stepped closer. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes wide. I need a ride," she said, voice trembling. "I got lost." James glanced around. Nothing but endless road and desert. No car, no signs of a town nearby. Just the wind whispering through the dry brush. "Where to?" he asked. She swallowed. 14 Maple Street. And she paused, then said a town he didn't recognize. James frowned but nodded, pushing open the passenger door. She climbed in, shivering slightly, though the night air was warm. He pulled back onto the highway, the silence stretching between them. "How'd you end up out here?" he finally asked. She shifted in her seat. "I don't remember. One moment I was with my family, the next I was alone." James glanced at her. There was something unsettling about the way she sat, too still, hands folded neatly in her lap. He tried to shake the unease creeping into his chest, but then he noticed something strange. The road felt longer. The same mile markers passed again and again, the same twisted Joshua trees appearing in his headlights. He checked his gas gauge. It hadn't moved. His heart started to pound. He reached for his GPS, typing in the address she had given him. Location not found. A cold sweat prickled his neck. James swallowed hard and turned to the woman. "Are you sure this place exists?" Silence. His breath hitched. She was gone. The passenger seat was empty, but the door had never opened. His hands tightened around the wheel, his breath coming fast. He flicked on the cabin light, scanning the seat, and then he saw it. A faded photograph, sitting where she had been. His fingers trembled as he picked it up. The image was old, sepia-toned. A family stood together in front of a house. A man, a woman, and a little girl in a white dress. His gaze landed on the girl. His stomach dropped. It was her. The woman he had just picked up. Scrawled in faded ink on the bottom were 4 words that sent ice through his veins. 14 Maple Street, 1952. James slammed on the brakes, his heart hammering. He twisted around, searching the dark highway. Nothing, just the empty road. And when he looked back at the photograph, the little girl was gone. The ride that never ended. The road stretched endlessly beneath the soft glow of the moon. Jack's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his eyes heavy from the long drive home. It had been a late night at work, and the empty highway ahead promised nothing but silence and solitude. Then, in the distance, a figure appeared. A young man stood by the roadside, one hand tucked into his hoodie pocket, the other raised in a lazy hitchhiker's wave. Jack hesitated. Something about picking up strangers in the middle of nowhere never sat right with him. But the kid looked young, too young to be out here alone at this hour. With a sigh, he slowed the car and rolled down the window. "Where you headed?" The hitchhiker stepped closer, his face dimly lit by the dashboard glow. His features were sharp but eerily expressionless, his dark eyes fixed on Jack. "Home," the boy said. "Just outside of town." Jack nodded and unlocked the door. The hitchhiker slid in without another word. They drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic hum of the tires on asphalt. "Which way?" Jack finally asked. "Take the next left," the boy said. Jack followed the direction, but something felt off. The road was unfamiliar, a narrow dirt path lined with thick trees. "Didn't know there were houses this way," Jack muttered. The boy didn't answer. A few minutes passed. Then, "Turn right," the boy instructed. Jack hesitated. "You sure?" "This doesn't." "Right," the boy repeated, his voice calm but insistent. A strange chill crept up Jack's spine. Still he obeyed. Another turn, then another. The road stretched on, winding deeper into the woods. Jack's grip on the wheel tightened. His stomach twisted. They had been driving for far too long. He flicked a glance at his fuel gauge. Still full. That didn't make sense. His eyes darted to the clock. The numbers flickered strangely, stuck at 2:14 a.m. The same time it had been when he picked the kid up. His pulse quickened. He looked around. The trees, the turns. They had passed this exact stretch before. "We're just looping," Jack muttered under his breath. "What the hell?" The boy turned to him, a slow grin stretching across his face. "We're almost there." Jack's heart slammed against his ribs. The air in the car grew thick, suffocating. His breath came shallow. Enough. His foot slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched, kicking up dust. The car shuddered to a stop. Silence. Jack's chest heaved as he turned to the boy. But the passenger seat was empty. Jack's throat clenched. His hands shook as he looked around. The woods were gone. The looping road was gone. His car sat perfectly still, parked in front of his own house. His porch light flickered. The wind whispered through the empty street. Jack's breath came fast. His fingers gripped the wheel so hard they ached. Then slowly, he looked down at the passenger seat. A single item remained. A faded old photo of his house. And standing at the front door was the hitchhiker, smiling. The wrong passenger. The highway stretched long and empty under the dim glow of the setting sun. A warm, golden haze clung to the edges of the sky, fading into deep purple as night approached. The hum of tires against asphalt was steady, almost hypnotic, as the car sped down the open road. Inside, laughter filled the air. For friends, Ethan, Sam, Rachel, and Mark were deep into their road trip, swapping stories and passing around a bag of chips. The radio crackled with static before Sam found an old rock station. "This place is dead," Rachel muttered, staring out at the deserted road. "I don't think we've passed another car in miles." As if on cue, Ethan squinted ahead and slowed the car. A lone figure stood by the roadside. An old man, hunched and still, with a long coat draped over his thin frame. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and he clutched a small, weathered suitcase in one hand. "Should we stop?" Mark asked. Rachel hesitated. "I don't know. He gives me weird vibes." "Oh, come on," Sam scoffed. "He's just an old guy. Probably needs a ride to the next town." Ethan pulled over. The man stepped closer, his face now partially visible, deep wrinkles, sunken eyes, an unreadable expression. "Where you headed, sir?" Ethan asked through the window. The old man tilted his head slightly. His voice was low and raspy. "If you don't mind, just down the road. I won't be much trouble." Mark leaned back with a shrug. "Why not?" The old man climbed into the back seat beside Rachel. His suitcase rested stiffly on his lap. The car pulled back onto the road, and for a while, silence lingered. Then the man spoke. "You kids are traveling through dangerous roads," he murmured. "Lots of strange stories around here." Ethan smirked. "Yeah? Like what?" The old man's fingers tapped against his suitcase. "There was a hitchhiker years ago. Vanished without a trace. Some say he still walks these roads, waiting for a ride he'll never get." The air in the car grew heavier. Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "That's a creepy." The old man gave a slow smile. "Oh, there are far worse stories than that." He went on, weaving chilling tales of disappearances, ghost towns, and lost travelers. His voice was soft but deliberate, each word sinking into the night like a whisper from the past. The road stretched on, the darkness outside pressing against the windows. Then, just as suddenly as he had begun, the old man fell silent. "This is my stop," he said abruptly. Ethan frowned. They were in the middle of nowhere. No lights, no signs of a house, just a vast, empty desert. "Are you sure?" The old man simply nodded. Without another word, he opened the door and stepped out. The wind howled as he walked off into the darkness, his form disappearing into the night. Ethan waited a moment, uneasy. Then, with a shake of his head, he pulled back onto the road. "That was weird," Rachel muttered. Sam exhaled. "No kidding." They drove in silence for a while, the old man's stories lingering in their thoughts. Then, the next morning, as they packed up their things at a roadside motel, Mark's voice cut through the air. "Guys," his tone was shaky. They turned. He held up an old, yellowed newspaper. "Where'd this come from?" Ethan frowned. "I don't know. It wasn't here last night." Mark slowly unfolded it. The front page sent chills down their spines. "Local man vanishes on highway. Last seen hitchhiking." And beneath it, a black and white photo of the old man. The date on the newspaper, 40 years ago.